What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to this new video where I'm going to teach you how you can make this beautiful fully functional weather app in React Native. So let's dive into the application, and here we have the live weather report of Islamabad city. You can search your own cities here. So if I type London, you will see we get all the results for the London, and if you click on any result, it will get the live weather report for that city. At the bottom you can see we have the weather forecast for next 7 days, so you can get the idea of how's the weather going to be for the next 7 days. Similarly, you can search any city you want in the world, and this will get the weather reports for that city. So if you want to add this application to your portfolio, then follow me along. We'll be building this application together. We're going to use other libraries as well in this application, starting with Native Wind. We're going to use Native Wind for styling. This package uses Tailwind CSS to style React Native components. Then we are going to use React Native hero icons because we need to display icons in our application. So we'll be using this library. Make sure you install React Native SVG as well. So this is how you can use them. If you go to Hero Icons website, you can explore a lot of icons. They have very beautiful collection of icons. You can see they have solid, mini, all these types of icons. So next we are going to add React Native progress. This is just a loader component that we will use to show loading in our application. Next, we're going to use React Native async storage because we're going to save the current city into local storage. So make sure you install this library as well. And next and the last thing we're going to use is our weather API. This is the API that we'll be using. This is called weatherapi.com. We'll be using trial version for this API. I believe they have 7 or 14 days of trial, and after that you have to pay. So these are the endpoints for this API. But we'll be using this later after the design. So let's move to our application. Here we have a very simple application that I've already installed using expo. This is the application entry point. We have this navigation implemented, and here we have the single route home. So I'll be using Tailwind CSS to design this application, but I'm not going to teach you how to integrate a Tailwind CSS, but I'll leave the video link in the description so you can check that out and add the Tailwind CSS in your application. So let's go to home screen and start designing our application. First, we need to add a view and we need to expand it to full screen, and it should be relative. Now we're going to use a status bar component, and we need to make our status bar light like this. If I make it dark, you'll be able to see the contents of the status bar, but we're going to use dark background, so let's use light. And we're going to use a background image that I've already added in my assets, and we need to make it absolute with full height and full width. Now let's import our image component as well. Now when I save it, you will see it's gonna look very ugly, but watch what happens when I add this property blur radius. Now it's looking a lot better. Now let's add our contents. So let's add safe area view. We need to make it full screen. Okay, now first we are going to add a search section here. Let's add a view for that, and it's going to have a fixed height of 7% of the full screen. So let's add a class name, and we're going to add a margin horizontal, and it should be relative, and let's give it as the index of 50. Okay, so here we are going to add a container for our search box. Justify and item should be centered and rounded full, and we're going to add a background of white. For that, I've already added a function in our theme section. So if I move to theme section, you will see we have theme background white. This takes an opacity, and you can choose the color of the opacity. So I'll be using that theme dot background white, and let's give it an opacity of 0.2. When I save this, nothing's gonna happen because we haven't added any content. So let's add a text input like this, and let's add a placeholder for search city, and let's define the color for the placeholder light gray. So now when I save this, you'll be able to see the content, but let's design it. So let me just format this and add a class name. Now we're going to add padding left of 6 and height of 10. Flux should be 1 because it's going to take all the space. Text white. Now it's looking a little better. So let's add a button for the search. So we're going to use touchable opacity. Let's also give it a background of white, but this time we're going to use opacity of 0.3 like this. And let's add a class name for padding and margin, and rounded should be full like this. Now we're going to use an icon here, and for that I've already mentioned the library hero icons, so I'll be using this library. Make sure you install this and React Native SVG. I've already installed them, so let's import them here. We're going to import hero icons and we're going to use outlined ones. Magnifying glass icon, we're going to use that here, and let's add a size and the color for the icon. Okay, now we can see the icon. So let's add a little padding bottom for the search input. Okay, now it's looking perfect. Okay, so now we need to be able to toggle the search bar. So let's add a state for that. Toggle search, and we're going to use state hook. By default this will be false, and when this shows search is true, we're going to show this search bar, otherwise we're going to show null. So let's move this here. Okay, so our search bar is gone. Now we need to be able to toggle this using this button. So we'll be using toggle search, and we need to pass the inverse value for show search. Now we can toggle the search input using this button, but we need to remove this background color. So let's add a condition here. So if the show search is true, we can use this color, otherwise we're going to add transparent color. So now our toggle search function is working perfectly. Now let's add a section for our search results. So we're going to use locations. Let's add a location state. By default, let's have a dummy value for 3 items, and we are going to only show this area when locations have data and show search is true, otherwise we're going to show null. So let's design our view, and this is going to be absolute because we're going to show it under the search bar. So let's give it a background of gray 300, top should be 16, and rounded 3xl. Okay, now let's map through all of the locations and show a button for all the locations. So let's map through them, location, index, and we're going to return a touchable opacity, and inside we need to display the place name and the country. So let's add London and United Kingdom. Okay, so if I open the search bar, you will see we have the results here. So let's design them. First we need to add a key for all the items. Key should be index, and let's add a class name. We're going to flex them because we're going to have an icon and the text. So let's add a padding of 3, and padding horizontal should be 4, and a margin bottom of 1. Okay, so let's add a border bottom because we're going to add a line at the bottom of each item. So let's add that. Now we're going to add an icon for each item. So let's add a map icon. We're going to use map pin icon, but we're going to use the solid ones, and these are the outlined ones. So let's just copy them and import only the map icon from the solid ones. So to change this to solid, and let's give it a size of 20, and color should be gray like this. Okay, looking good. Now we need to remove the border bottom from the last item. So let's add a check for that. We'll check if the current item index not equals to the total items, then we will show the border. And using that condition, we're going to add border class. Show border is true. Then we're going to add this class. Let's copy it here. Otherwise, we're going to add nothing. Okay, so let's add this class here, border class. Okay, so the border bottom from the last item is gone and now it looks perfect. So next we're going to design this text. Let's add a text dark, and text should be large and margin left should be 2. Okay, now it looks perfect. Now let's add a location handler on this button. So when user presses this button, we're going to fetch the forecast for this location. So let's add a function for that, handle location, and for now we'll be just console log this location here, location. Okay, so I think this is it for this section. Let's just reload, and this section is complete. Now let's work on our forecast section. So let's add a view, and it's going to have a horizontal margin. Flex should be column because it's going to show all the items in a column, and flex should 1 because it's going to take full space. Then we're going to show location details here, and let's add a text view for that. So we'll be designing this to text white, text should be centered and 2XL, and font should be bold. So it's going to show London here, and then we're going to have another text view inside this to show United Kingdom, and we need to make it a little gray. So let's add a gray 300 color. Let's add United Kingdom. Okay, so this is done. Now let's move forward and add our weather image here. Let's add a view for that, and we're going to make it centered. Flex row, justify center, and let's add an image. We just use a random image for now. Assets image, leave cloudy, and let's give it a height and width of 52. Okay, now looking perfect. Now let's design our degrees Celsius data. So let's add a view for that. Let's add a spacing vertical of 2, and let's add a text view for the degree Celsius. It's going to be a very big text, so let's add text wide, centered, and text 6SL, and margin left of 5. So let's add 23 for now, and if you want to add degree, just use this symbol and hash and 176 and then a semicolon. This will add a degree to your number. So let's just copy this and add a text for the weather condition, partly cloudy. Okay, so we need to make it a little small. Let's move this, and let's add tracking widest. This will add a word spacing. Okay, so next we're going to add more stats like humidity and the sunrise time. So let's flex them and justify them between, and let's give it a margin of horizontal. Let's add a view for each stat. So we're going to flex them. Spacing horizontal should be 2 and item should be centered. Okay, we're going to have an image of the wind here because I've already added these icons into my assets. So we're going to have the wind image for the wind speed, and we're going to have a height of 6 and width of 6. As you can see, we have the wind image, and we need to add a text for the wind speed. Text should be white and font should be semi-bold, and it should be a little large, 22 kilometers per hour. Okay, so now we need to copy this 2 more times to show our humidity and sunrise time. So let's just change this to 23% humidity, and this is going to be sunrise time AM. Okay, so we need to change the icons drop and sun. Okay, this area is looking nice. Now moving forward, we're going to have a forecast section for the next days. So let's add a view for them. Now let's give it a margin bottom of 2 and a spacing vertical of 3. Okay, now let's add another view and flex them, because we're going to have a calendar icon here and a daily forecast text. So let's add an icon, calendar days icon. Okay, this one, and we're going to give it a size of 22 and color should be white. Okay, as you can see, we have the calendar icon. Now we're going to add a text for the daily forecast. Text should be base, should say daily forecast. Now we're going to add a scroll view for all the days. So let's add a scroll view. It's going to be horizontal, and let's define a padding horizontal for the container 15, and we don't need to show sliders, so let's hide them. Now let's add a view for each day. So we're going to design it. Let's add a class name. Let's flex, and it's going to be centered and items should be centered, and we're going to give it a width of 24 like this. Rounded should be 3xl and padding vertical should be 3, a little spacing vertical, and lastly we're going to give it a margin right of 4. Now let's add a background of white for this as well, and this time we're going to use the background opacity of 0.15. So let's add 0.15, and when I save this you're not gonna see it because we haven't added any content. So let's add an image first. This will be the forecast image, and for now we'll be using a dummy image, heavy rain, and let's give it a class name for the height and width. Let's give it a height of 11 and width of 11, and if I save this you can see the card now. So let's add more info. Next we're going to add the day name. So let's add a text. Text should be white. It's going to be Monday. And next we're going to add a number for the degree Celsius. So text should be white and text should be extra large, and font should be semi bold. Let's just copy the number from above like this, and let's paste it here. Let's change it. Okay, we have our cards, so let's just copy and paste this few more times for all the days. Okay, now this is how all the days are going to look like. So let's just change this to Tuesday for now. Okay, for this our application design is complete, and you can see we have the forecast and all the search area content and all the forecast days. Next, we are going to implement this API into our application. So make sure you're logged in with this website. And when you go to dashboard, the first thing you will notice is your API key here. And we're going to use this API key into API Explorer section. This is the test environment for their API. So just copy this API and paste it here. We're going to use HTTPS, JSON, and this is the query for the API. And these are all the endpoints for their API. So we're going to use search autocomplete, and when I hit this API you can see I get all the results for the London, and these are all the locations that I can get the weather forecast for. And the second API that we're going to use is the forecast. Here we can provide the days, and if I show the response you can see we have the location and the current forecast for this location. Here we have temperature in Fahrenheit, Celsius, and then we have this icon image here. Then we can see the humidity, and then we have this forecast day section, which I think is the forecast for the next days. So this API has all the data that our application needs, and we'll be implementing this API. So let's move to our application and create a API folder for our weather app. So let's create a weather.js file, and we're going to use Axios for requesting the weather data. Make sure you install this package. And next thing, we're going to copy our API key, and we need to store it into our constants. Don't worry about these images, I will explain them in a bit. So we need to copy the API key here, and then we can import the API key here like this. And next we're going to add our endpoints. So we're going to have a forecast endpoint. It's going to be a function so that it will receive all the parameters, and we will replace all the parameters in the endpoint. So let's just copy the endpoint from here. This is the endpoint. Let's just copy and paste here, and we will replace the API key with the one that we stored in our constants file. So let's add our API key here, and we also need to replace the parameters for the query. We're going to add a city name from the parameters that will pass later from the component. So let's add here, and we're also going to add days, params dot days. Now let's leave other parameters as it is. Now let's copy this one more time and change it to locations endpoint. And for the locations, let's move to the website, and we're going to use autocomplete search, and the file name is called search. So let's just copy the file name, and we'll change the file name to search, and we will remove all the other parameters except city name. Okay, so these are for the endpoints. Now next thing we're going to add is an API call method. We'll be declaring it as an async method because we'll be calling the endpoint here. We will receive the endpoint, and we need to declare some options with the method get and the endpoint as an URL. Let's add try catch blocks for our API. So if there are any errors, we will just console log them errors here, console log error, and we will return null from here, null. Okay, so let's get the response from our API. So let's use await keyword, await axios dot request, and we'll pass our options. Now on the response object, we have this data property that we can return to display the forecast data. Now let's create another function to fetch the forecast data, and we will pass parameters to this function, and using these parameters we can generate a URL with all these parameters. We need to call forecast endpoint. This will send all these parameters to here, this function, and this function will replace all these dynamic values with the parameters that we are passing. So we'll get a dynamic URL for the endpoint, and we need to call this API with this URL that we created. You can pass this like this, or you can just directly call the function as a parameter. So let's just copy this and use it here. You can do this as well. Now let's copy this and change it to fetch locations, and we need to change this endpoint for the location as well. Okay, so we have defined all the APIs that we will need, and the next thing we are going to do is use them to fetch the forecast data. So let's move to the home screen. Let me just resize this window like this. Okay, let's move to home screen, and here we're going to add a change text function to this input. So let's add that on change text handle search. Now we will have a problem with this function because this is going to be triggered every time user types a value, but we can't call the API every time user types a value. That will just create more traffic on their server. Let me just show you what I mean by that. So if I type a value, you will see this is triggered every time, and you see the value printed on the console. So we are going to use a debounce method from Lodash that will make sure this function will only be triggered after a given time. So that will fix our problem. So let's use callback, and let's import the debounce method from Lodash. Let's just use the debounce. I think we have to manually import it. Debounce, and then we need to provide the function and then the time after it should be executed, and then an empty array for the use callback so that it is only triggered one time. Let's use it here. We're getting an error. I think it's because we used the handle search before we declared it, so let's just move it down. Okay, I think it's fixed the issue. Now if I type anything, you will see it will be printed after the given time. As you can see, it's working. So if I type anything, it will wait for 1.2 seconds and then it will print the value in the console. So that means it's working. So now let's use our fetch locations API here, and we need to pass the city name, and we can get the city name from the value. Then we will get the data. If the API was successful, we'll just console log the data for now. We also need to make a condition here so that if the search value has over 2 characters, only then we will call the API. So let's move it into this condition. Okay, so now it should be working. Let me just make the console bigger. Now if I type anything, and this should call the API, and now we are getting the data in the console. This data includes an array, and this has all the objects that we search for, and each object contains a country name and all the latitude longitude information that we can use. So let's remove our dummy data, and we need to set this location after we get them from API. Here, set locations to data. Now we can use this to display in our map method where we use the dummy values. So if I type anything, you will see we are getting the data, but we are still showing the dummy data. So let's remove this dummy data and change this to the actual data that we are getting from the API. So let's remove this London and change this to location dot name, and we'll be getting a country here. So let's replace it with country. And now you can see all the locations changed, and this is the correct data that is coming from the API. So we'll be passing the location to this function, and we can use that location to fetch the forecast data. So we have all this data in the console, but we only need the name. So we'll be passing the name. So first of all, let's remove all the locations when we press on any location, and then we're gonna add fetch forecast method, and we need to pass the city name, and this will be location dot name, and then we're gonna add days for our forecast. And when we get the data, we need to console log it, got data. Let's just console log this. Let's change this to got forecast like this, and when I click on this, you will see we got the forecast data. Let me just make it bigger. We have this Okay, we have this current data, which includes condition for the weather and icon, and we have this pressure, humidity, the name for the location. Okay, so we're getting all the data that we need. So using this API, show response. Okay, so here's all the data that we just got, and we can use this to show into our application. So let's create a state to store this data, weather. By default, this will be an empty object. We also need to toggle this search bar so that when we press on this location, this will be hidden. So let's make this off, and then we need to set this weather data into our state like this. And now if we press any location, this will get the data and set the weather data into our state. So let's minimize this, and now we can get the current and location data from our weather object like this. You can see we have the current and the weather location data in your state, so we can use this to display the real data instead of dummy. So let's remove this and use location dot name. Then we can add location dot country like this. I think we need to have a little space before this country. Okay, now looks perfect. Now the next thing we're gonna add is the temperature, degree Celsius. So that we can get from current object using temperature C, and we have this condition with the text moderate rain. So let's display the temperature first. Current dot temp C. This will display the temperature. Next we're going to use the condition object to display the weather condition text. like this. Next we're gonna use the images, and we already getting the image icons in the API, so let's try to display them. So URI, HTTPS, and then the icon from the condition object. Okay, I think we need to remove the slashes. Okay, so we're getting the icon, but as you can see, this is very blurry and the quality is not good. So we're not going to use this. Instead, we are going to use our own icons that I've already saved into the assets folder. So we have this cloud, then we have this heavy rain, moderate rain, partly cloudy. So we have the icon for all the conditions, and I've created a file to include all of these assets. So in here I've added all the images against all the text for the conditions. So we'll be using these images instead of the images that we are getting in the API. So let's use our weather images here, weather images, and we will use the key as the text from the condition, like this. And when I save this, it's not going to change because the weather is already partly cloudy. So let's change our location and see if we're getting another image. Islamabad. Okay, now we're getting the images with the live data, so it's working. So let's move to other stats and show this wind and humidity levels. If we move over to the API, we have this wind kilometer per hour and then humidity levels. So let's use them here. We're going to use current dot wind dot kilometer per hour. This will show the wind speed, and then we're going to use the humidity here. This will show the humidity levels, and we're gonna leave the sunrise time for now. We'll add that later. Now we're gonna add forecast for the next days. We have this forecast and forecast day array. We're going to use this array to display the forecast for the next days. So let's loop through this forecast array. We have weather dot forecast, and then we have forecast day as an array. We're going to loop through all the days, and then we're going to return this single item as a day. Let's return this. Let's reformat this, and we don't need other dummy values, so let's just collapse them and remove them all like this. Now we should be able to get the forecast days. I think we misspelled the forecast, so let's fix this. Now we're getting the days, so let's add a key for each day. Then we need to add the day name, so we can get the date from each day, and we're seeing the date, and then we need to specify the temperature Celsius, and we should be getting this from day and average temp C. So let's define that, average temp C. Now we can see the temperature for all the days. Now next thing we're gonna add is the image for all the days. So let's remove this, and we're gonna use our weather images, and the key can be found in item day condition dot text, like this. Okay, so we are seeing the images now. All the data is complete, but we need to display the day name, not the dates. So let's add a date, item dot date here, and we're gonna use some options to convert this to day name, weekday long, and we're going to convert this to local date string, ENGUS. Okay, like this. And then we are going to use day name here. Okay, we are getting the day name, but we also need to remove this date, so we can split this by this comma, and the first object should be the day name. So let's save this. Now we're getting the day name. So all of our data is complete and dynamic. We're getting all the data through API. So let's use London and see the weather in London, getting the locations, and we're getting all the data from the forecast API. But we have one more problem where if I refresh this application, you will see all the data is gone, and that's because we're not calling the API when application starts. So let's create a use effect hook here, and we will call a function that will fetch the data when application mounts. So let's define this function, fetch my weather data. We need to make it async. Then we need to call this API, and we need to pass a predefined city name Islamabad, and days should be 7. And when we get this data, we will set this to weather state so that when we first reload the application, we can see the weather data. Okay, so when I refresh this, you will see after a second we are getting the data that we predefined here. Now we're gonna need a loader, and that we are going to use React Native Progress. I've already copied this, so let me just copy and paste it here. We're going to show this loader when we are getting the data or the location. So let's add a state for the loading. By default this will be false. Actually, let's just make it true, and we need to show this loading in here. So let's add a condition so that when loading is true, we're going to show the loading. Otherwise, we're going to show this whole safe area view. Let's just copy and paste it here. And let's format this. Let's just indent it like this. Then we're gonna have a view for the loading. So this will have the full screen, flex row, justify centered, and item centered. Let's add a text for now to see if this was working. Loading, and class name should be text wide and text 4XL. Okay, we are seeing the loading, so we need to add the loading and set the loading to false when we get the data. So now we have the data, that's why it is not showing. But when we press on the location, we need to turn it off, sorry, on. So we will show the loading here, and when we get the data, then we will set it to false, so the loading can be false here. And let's comment these. Now let's try to get the weather condition for London to see if our loader is working. Okay, we are seeing the loader, that means it's working. Now we need to replace this text with our progress bar, so we're going to use a circular progress bar. Let's use circle snail, and we need to define the thickness and the size for this circle and the color for this circle. I've already added this custom color, so just copy this or you can use your own. So if I refresh this, um, this should be hash, sorry. Okay, so now we should be able to see this loader whenever I add any other city. So that was very small, so we need to increase the size to 140 like this, and now we should be able to see it. Okay, that was very quick. Let's try to fetch the weather forecast for Lahore. Okay, we are getting the icon and the loader is working perfectly fine. Now we have only one issue in our application, and that is when I refresh this application, you will see Islamabad, because that we defined in our use effect hook. So we need to make it like if user searches for a location, we will save that location into his device, and we will use that location to show whenever he opens the application again. So we need to use this React Native async storage to store the city name. So let's create a file for that, async storage. I will just copy and paste the code into this file, and I will just explain it. So this is the code for the async storage. This is the library, and we have two functions here, store data and get data. Store data will store the data against a key, otherwise it will throw an error. And then we have this get data, and this will get us the data against a key, or this will throw an error. So we'll use this into our home component to store our city. When user clicks on the location, we're going to store the data into storage against a key city, and the value will be location.name like this. This will save the data into storage, and then we need to get this data when I call fetch my weather data. So we will have a variable my city, and we will get the city value here, and by default we will have a city name Islamabad. And if we got the data my city, then we will change the city name to my city like this, and then we can just replace this city name here. Okay, so this is all done. Now let's try to test it. It should save the data into local storage. So let's get the data for Lahore. Let's click on location. Now this location is stored into async storage. So if I refresh the page, you will see we're still getting the forecast for Lahore. So let's use another city. So now if I refresh, you will still see the London location like this. And even if I remove this application from memory and open this again, you will still see London because we will be getting the London city from our local storage, and we will get the data from API and we'll show it here. Okay, so our async storage is working and we're getting all the data. We're showing the forecast for the next 7 days. The only thing left to do is add the sunrise time for today. So let's fix that. So let's open this section, this one, and we need to make this dynamic. So in the API, we have sunrise against day, sorry, astro, and inside astro we have the sunrise. So we need to go to forecast day 1, and then astro, and then sunrise. So let's use that here. We need to remove this weather dot forecast, and forecast day we'll be using first item, then we will be using astro, and then sunrise. Okay, so now our sunrise is dynamic and it's coming from the live API. So with this, our application is complete and we have made this application fully functional using weather API. If you still have any questions about anything, you can ask them into the comment section and I will try to answer them as soon as possible. I'll be pushing this code live on my GitHub repo and I will provide the link into the video description so you can check out all the assets and all the code. Do like the video and subscribe the channel for more videos like this, and see you in the next video.